All right, chapter 6. This one's called Resurrection, and a conversation that you may want to have at some point, maybe even this week, if you're studying with someone who's thinking through faith, maybe they're new to faith, maybe they're non-Christian, is ask, are you ready to follow Jesus? Or maybe, what are your thoughts on following Jesus? If you haven't yet, then this week really is the perfect time to check in, see what their current thoughts on God are, and help them to take the next step if they're ready. So as always, as we start these studies, pray together and get their thoughts on the previous chapter's pre-work before you jump on in. This lesson about the central story of the New Testament, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. These are some longer passages, but we need to read them if we're going to understand what is going on in this story. Then after that, we're going to spend some time processing grace together and what Jesus' death really means for us today in the lives that we live. So in Matthew 26, verses 17 to 30, we get Matthew's account of the Last Supper. And there's a lot going on here. We've got Judas's betrayal, Jesus's foreknowledge that adds an interesting dimension to what's going on here. And we have all of this occurring during the Passover. And Jesus is intentionally pulling in these themes and making connections. So remember, the Passover occurred in Exodus. It was the last of the 10 plagues. It was the death of the Egyptian firstborn. And the Israelites were instructed to mark the doorposts of their homes with the blood of a slaughtered spring lamb. And upon seeing this, the Spirit of the Lord knew to pass over the firstborn in each of these homes of these Israelites. So the holiday is literally about the blood of an innocent lamb saved, how it saved God's people. So this holiday is literally about how the blood of an innocent lamb saved God's people. And Jesus is going to lean really hard into this imagery. And this institution of the Passover becomes now for us as Christians the Lord's Supper, an institution that we still follow today, calling it different names like Lord's Supper, Communion, Eucharist maybe. So during a traditional Passover meal, the host would break the bread and share it with those around the table. This was a normal thing. They would have expected this. And Jesus is identifying himself with the Passover sacrifice. He is claiming to be the fulfillment of the Passover ceremonies. This is a big deal. It's significant also that Jesus uses bread, not a lamb. So at a Passover ceremony, they would have had 4 different items there. They would have had unleavened bread, they would have had some bitter herbs, they would have had the Passover offering, aka a lamb, and they also would have had 4 cups of wine there. But Jesus uses the bread for us to take and to eat, signifying that he is now the Passover lamb who has died for the sins of the people. And killing lambs is no longer necessary. Today, as we continue this tradition, we don't have a lamb to sacrifice because Jesus is it. He says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins." The cup is significant as Jesus is indicating that he is fulfilling the new covenant promised to the people of Israel in books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. This cup would most likely have been the 3rd cup of the meal, which would have been drunk after the eating had finished, and it was called the cup of redemption, named after Exodus 6:6, which reads, "I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment." So there's a lot going on here. Obviously, you don't need to reiterate everything I just said, and there's probably more connections that I've missed. But I think this is helpful with these questions to connect that Jesus is talking about the significance of his upcoming death and his resurrection, that is rooted in the Old Testament sacrificial system, and that as we take communion each week, we are remembering what Jesus has done for us. Next, as we turn to Matthew 27 and 28, we're going to read these together and discuss our thoughts. And there's so much to cover here, even more than in the past lesson. But what we want to hone in on is first just getting a sense of the story. What actually happens? And we get that just by reading, just by processing these words. And second, processing the significance with the following few questions we wrote in there. So what's the significance of Jesus' death and his resurrection? So I like to make them explain to me, without using any Christian words, what just happened and why should I care? I'll often say, if you were speaking to someone who's from another country, someone who knows nothing about Christianity, and it's hard to do, it's hard to say these things without using these little Christian words, but I think it's helpful for us to wrap our minds around it outside of all the Christian cliches. This resurrection, it fulfills the deepest hopes of humanity. This expectation that the righteous will be resurrected to a new life after death becomes fulfilled. Prophecies like Isaiah 26:19, Daniel 12:2. And Jesus is now the one through whom we are saved. A call back to Romans 1, 2, and 6, or a call forward, if you will. Jesus, the crucified one, lives now as the risen one. The women and later the disciples who see him resurrected bodily and physically, and that's a big deal too. Now we're called to join in with him. Now with this great commission, we're to join with him, and as he makes this world new. Now, because we don't expect you all to be amazing preachers, the next thing we're going to do together is watch the Sacrifice and Atonement Bible Project video, which is going to help pull out a lot of what we've just said. A lot of the big themes of this previous passage are all going on here. It's going to reiterate it all, and more importantly, it's going to make these connections really clear, because between, on one hand, Jesus' death and atoning work, and on the other hand, our own personal sin. He makes that connection for us that I think is very helpful. The next two questions are about evil in this world. It's an attempt to process just how widespread the sin problem is, and how it affects every part of our daily lives and the world we live in. Again, the Bible Project does a great job of introing these themes and pulling them out. Finally, we have the question on the significance of baptism and the Lord's Supper. We've already talked about those, so if you need to skip it, feel free to. But it's there to reiterate the meaning behind these powerful moments, where we, as believers 2,000 years later, can join with Jesus and believers throughout the centuries. And most importantly, we can think through how we think about them. And now, on to Romans 6. So all of these questions are to get at the heart of Paul's message here, where he takes us one step forward. So we've been set free from sin by Jesus, and now, the next step, that should transform us and change how we live in dramatic ways. It transforms us in all kinds of ways. It changes our behavior, it gives us new motivation, it gives us a clean slate, we can have better relationships, we can have changed lives, and so on. But I think fundamentally, at the core of all of this, the grace of Jesus has reshaped your identity. You are no longer who you were. You may identify as being a difficult person, or a porn addict, or someone who sleeps around, or someone who always fails, always messes up. But the good news is that's not your identity anymore. That's what Paul is trying to get across. In verse 14 it says, "For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace." You can identify as a child of God, washed clean, beloved, and no longer bound by who you once were. Yes, it still may be difficult to quit sin. Yes, you still may struggle. But as 1 Corinthians 6:11 says, that is what some of you were. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by the Spirit of our God. This is your new identity. Believe it, is what he's trying to get across. So finally, process with the final question here. What would it look like to be as free from sin as Paul claims? And do you really believe it's possible? Why or why not? This is where they think through their own life. If they were free from sin, how would their life be different? Spoiler alert, it would change everything. It's awesome, it's good. And do they really buy it though? Do they really believe this? It's okay to say no. They may not really know God very well. They may struggle to trust Him. And I would encourage you, if this is where they're at, if they're struggling to trust Him, then send them to God in prayer this week. Tell them to talk to Him directly. He's not afraid of your questions, not afraid of your doubts. And as you follow Jesus throughout your life, He's going to make good His promises. Finally, in making connections, these passages in Hebrews and Romans, they help paint a picture of the fullness of who Jesus is. If you're a Christian and you've read these before, try to read them as if you were a newcomer to faith. Try to read them with fresh eyes. Jesus is the heir. He is the exact representation of God. He's also called the image of the invisible God in other places. He sustains all things. Because of Him, our lives are changed. All of creation has been waiting for Him to appear. Now the Spirit's coming. There's so much good stuff, especially in Romans 8. We could literally preach sermons about Romans 8 with all the cool stuff in there. But importantly, these passages, they help point out something we may not have explicitly said, although most have hopefully picked it up by now, that Jesus is God among us. This is who the Messiah is. He is God Himself incarnate, the fullness of all of that, the meaning of all of that. So lean into that. So close with a prayer, encourage them to check out this pre-work for this week, and if they need to, encourage them to go to God in prayer. Thank you so much, guys. See you next week.